Senator Boson would like to announce some guests with her this morning. Under the south balcony are children, Heidi, Johnny, Betsy, and Zoe Boson. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator Boson would like to recognize the physician of the day, Dr. Rachel Blake of Lincoln. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Mr. Clerk, please record.
There's quorum present, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Are there any corrections for the journal?
I have no corrections at this time.
Are there any messages, reports, or announcements?
I have one, Mr. President. Notice a committee hearing from the Natural Resources Committee. That's all I have this time.
Thank you. Speaker Arch, you are recognized for a message.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, good morning, by the way. I would like to share with you my intentions for scheduling our rules debate over the next 4 days. As I've stated previously, I intend to end rules debate at adjournment on Friday the 19th and begin morning floor debate on bills on Monday, January 22nd, our first day of committee hearings in the afternoon. As I considered the limited time before us for rules debate, I reflected that the Rules Committee advanced 12 proposed rule changes on a 5-0 vote and 5 proposed rule changes on a 3-2 vote. That calculates to approximately 2/3 and 1/3. In an effort to be fair in my scheduling, I intend to divide the hours available in the same manner. So counting our debate last Thursday, we have a total of approximately 27 hours available for rules debate. With the total hours available, it will divide approximately into 18 hours for the 5-0 proposed rule changes and 9 hours for the 3-2 rule changes. That means that I intend to end debate on the 5-0 rule changes no later than adjournment on Wednesday, tomorrow. That will equate to approximately 18 hours. On today's agenda, all of the 5-0 rule changes to be considered are listed, so you can take a look at those. Wherever we are on this list, we will end debate on these items and move to the 3-2 proposed rule changes at approximately 11 a.m. on Thursday, immediately following the State of the State address in the morning. This will provide us with approximately 9 hours to debate these items before adjournment on Friday, assuming we work through lunch to approximately 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. I have not yet decided on the order of the 5 3-2 proposed rule changes that I will schedule on the agenda. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Clerk, for the first item on the agenda.
Excuse me, Mr. President. Notice a committee hearing from the Banking, Commerce, Insurance Committee. First item on the agenda, proposed rule change 18 from Speaker John Arch concerning Rule 6, Section 5.
Speaker Arch, you're recognized to open.
Thank you, Mr. President. So proposed rule change number 18, one that I am proposing, addresses E&R amendments. So what this proposed rule change does is E&R amendments would be voted on without debate on select file. E&R amendments would not be debatable, divisible, nor amendable. With the vote on the E&R amendments, they are immediately adopted. So it's simply an up-down vote on E&R amendments. Amendments to the language of the E&R amendment would be allowed during debate of the bill once the E&R amendment is passed. So there is still an opportunity to change the language of the E&R amendment, now part of the bill. However, as amended by the Rules Committee, the principal introducer of the bill will be allowed to speak for 5 minutes before the vote on the E&R amendment. This provision, at the recommendation of Senator John Kavanaugh, was put in to address the very rare occasion when a principal introducer has a concern with a portion of the E&R amendment. This will allow the principal introducer to voice that concern to the body prior to the vote and either ask for the E&R amendment to not be adopted or to set the foundation for introducing an amendment to remove the portion of the E&R amendment objected to as an amendment to the bill. So I want to pause there for a second and talk a little bit about the discussion that was held regarding this change. One of the concerns that was expressed was on that rare occasion where perhaps that primary introducer feels as though the E&R amendment went beyond simply technical changes and now actually made some changes, whether it be through punctuation or some additional language, whatever it may be, actually made some changes that are substantive to the meaning and the intent of the bill. And so if you simply have an up-down and that primary introducer has no opportunity to speak, then the question is, well, how can that get expressed? And so the Rules Committee did amend my proposed rule by inserting this language, and I believe that it's been, when it was sent around, the language that was inserted has been highlighted to make it easy for you to follow. And so that was the intent there, that the principal introducer can stand up and say, I've got a problem with this. And so then during the debate on the bill, an amendment can be introduced and specific to the language that has been adopted then to the E&R. So amendments to the language would be allowed during the debate of the bill, and it wouldn't be specific to the E&R amendment, but the language would already be adopted into the bill. I think this will move the debate to the bill itself more efficiently, and this was the historical practice. E&R amendments were routinely passed because they should be, and by far the majority of cases, they are technical amendments, and then it can move to the bill. So it was the historical practice from 1986 to 2021. I think that should be codified so that we don't have this can be used as a way to jump the line and start debating the bill, and we should just deal with the E&R amendments and move to the debate of the bill. So with that, I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Speaker Arch. Senator Dungan, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I do rise today, I guess, in tentative support of this proposed rule change. I do have some questions about it, I guess, that I'm curious to kind of work through here together, and I think it's something we should have a conversation about. I see a few other people in the queue, including Senator John Kavanaugh, who's punched in now to talk about maybe some of his additions that I do want to hear more about. But I want to take a step back and kind of just acknowledge to those listening at home that a lot of this is very in the weeds. I understand that a lot of times these rules conversations are a little bit more 30,000 foot view or maybe even 60,000 foot view in terms of what we're doing here. But it gets a little bit confusing when you start talking about what enrollment and review amendments are. I'll acknowledge that when I first came into the legislature, it was difficult for me to understand all the jargon. I think that more so than a lot of other entities, we sort of live in our world of talking in our acronyms and our abbreviations. And I heard a lot E&R. E&R amendments, or this is going to be an E&R fix, or something like that. And as the speaker just laid out, what that essentially means is enrollment and review. So after a bill comes from general file, it gets passed off of general file, and it goes on to select file, the second round of debate, it essentially goes up to the bill drafters for E&R enrollment and review amendments. And as the speaker indicated, these are most of the time technical changes, right? They look through the language, and there's been a debate that's happened or a conversation that's happened, and they realize that, you know, this line has to be modified by adding a comma here, or we need to add a little bit of language in this section to make it harmonious with other provisions of the law. But as Senator Wayne indicated last week, and I think this was a very, very good point, is that a comma can oftentimes change the entire structure of a sentence. And so I absolutely agree that E&R or enrollment and review amendments are by nature meant to be technical, but I think it's really important that we ensure that we acknowledge these E&R amendments could, from time to time, modify bills. I've only been here for one session, so I've not seen a circumstance like that myself, but in looking at these rules and talking with other colleagues of mine who have been around for much longer than me, they have seen times that E&R amendments have come back and have substantively changed the bill's language in such a way that it's actually altered the outcome of what the bill does. So I think that's important to note. I understand the desire here is to not let people jump the queue. I understand the desire here is to just get to substantive debate on the rule, which I think is frankly laudable, and I think is something that we should often, focus on, is keeping the debate that we have here on what's on the board and what we're actually talking about. But I do want to just make sure that we acknowledge that the modification of E&R amendments is important and can, from time to time, I think, be substantive in nature. I think the fact that the Speaker and Senator John Kavanaugh and others have worked together to find a potential fix to that problem is significant. Continuing a lot with our theme that we talked about last week, this, I think, demonstrates the desire amongst a lot of folks here to get together and try to work on some of these problems as opposed to being entrenched. So I'm excited to hear more from John Kavanaugh about his sort of suggestion there, but I don't know if it necessarily fixes the problem. And the reason I say that is if the only modifications that can be done to an E&R amendment have to be a substantive amendment to the bill on select file, it is entirely possible that we will never get there if there are other amendments and other things on the board that ultimately push that amendment to modify the E&R amendment down the queue. So that's a complicated way of saying if you're not able to make amendments to the E&R amendment itself first, it is possible, thank you, Mr. President, it's possible that you may never actually get to your amendment down the road that is trying to change those things that you think are substantive. And that's problematic because what you could end up with then is a bill that ultimately gets voted on, select file, and it makes its way to final reading. And then you have to then have a motion to bring back to select file for the purposes of a specific amendment modifying the E&R amendments. It becomes a quagmire. And I know that I'm saying a lot of words that probably don't make a lot of sense to folks who don't follow this super clearly. But at the end of the day, what I'm getting at is we need to be very careful when modifying these rules that we don't overlook the possibility that an E&R amendment could and might need to be changed in the desire to sort of streamline debate. I think that this body functions its best when we're all focused on the issues at hand. I think this body functions best when we're all working together to come up with solutions. And I trust that the rule, as it always has been, is
That's your time,
Thank you,
Senator.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dungan. Mr. Clerk, for a motion.
Mr. President, priority motion. Speaker Arch move to recommit the proposed rule change 18 to the Rules Committee.
Speaker Arch, you're recognized to open on the motion to recommit.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we did with my first two rules, proposed rules, I have filed a motion to recommit, priority motion, and two placeholder amendments as well. And so as in my first two rules, I would ask that when we are finished in the debate of the recommit, I would ask that you vote no. And then we can move on to amendments. And I know some of you have submitted amendments. I'm discussing those with you now. And I'm willing to substitute. If you have an amendment that you think is substantive that you would like to substitute for one of the two of the placeholder amendments that I have, please come and talk with me. So again, this is just to structure the debate, and we can continue our debate on this rule within the recommit motion. But when it comes time for a vote, I would ask that you vote no. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senator Conrad, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning, colleagues. In deference to how the Speaker is structuring this aspect of the debate, I rise in opposition to this motion to recommit, which has essentially been filed as a protective measure in regards to the Speaker's rules that he has put forward on the agenda today and that have been advanced by the Rules Committee with some amendment. That's a really good place to start, I think, for a few global notes in addition. So the first thing that I'm hoping that maybe members of the Rules Committee may commit to, maybe thinking about as we work through the debate this morning, and I see my friend Senator Ehrman's on the phone, so I'm not going to ask him to yield, but we'll make sure to triple check off the mic as well, is that we have received a significant amount of feedback from those voices in our second house who are trying to understand how this process works. And as an institution that prides itself rightly on committing to transparency and engagement, as we do with all business before the legislature, every bill having a public hearing, executive sessions being open to the press, well, at least for the meantime, we'll debate that later, having no secret conference committee, taking votes on the record, all of these critical pieces of open government and transparency, which are hallmarks of this proud institution and align with our proud political culture in Nebraska, are a bit out of alignment when it comes to structuring this rules debate. As we noted last week, these rules do not go through the bill drafting process as per other matters coming before the legislature, but instead are coordinated with the clerk's office. And it is confusing as people are trying to work through these to see the various proposals that have been put forward, to go back and kind of juxtapose those in the journal to try and figure out what the original proposal is, what the underlying substantive rule subject to amendment is, and then what potential committee amendments from the Rules Committee have come forward, in addition to the priority motions on the board and any placeholder or protective or substantive and serious amendments that other senators have also filed. So I do hope, and I believe I've heard through the grapevine, and maybe Senator Erdman has even committed to such on the record, but once we get past this component of our debate this session, I understand that the Rules Committee is serious about continuing its work into the interim period, and I am hopeful that perhaps we can figure out a better way to present proposed rules changes so that each member has full and fair opportunity to assess where we're at, and it's a little bit more accessible and a little bit more understandable for Nebraska citizens and members of our second house as well. So when I was thinking about how to approach the rules debate last week and carrying those lenses forward to this week after some time to digest and contemplate what we were able to accomplish together last week and what we have on our agenda before us this week, I'm trying to figure out how each word and each vote and each act can indeed help to support the appropriate vision that the speaker has set forward for us as an overarching issue this session, to protect and strengthen the institution, which includes its independence. Thank you, Mr. President, which includes its modernization, which includes its operation. I'm also looking forward, and I think we were able to accomplish this to a significant degree last week, and it sounds like we're on the same track today, utilizing the opportunity of the rules debate to reestablish relationships and to reestablish tone that are in line with our proud political culture in this nonpartisan institution and in this state. And then finally, to use these opportunities to embrace a learning opportunity for all members, particularly new members in the term limits era, to think deeply and with discernment about what our rules are. In letter and in spirit, and then what that means for execution. So I do think that there are a lot of benefits in addition to what the speaker has put forward, some related to technical corrections, some related to codifying precedent, and some related to process improvement. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Senator John Kavanaugh, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I hope everybody had a good weekend. I had a great adventure of my weekend I'd love to tell everybody about, but I'll tell you about it off the mic. So we're here again debating rules, and I hope, again, everybody has come with a spirit of collaboration and open-mindedness about both what's a good idea, what's a bad idea, and to listen to people who have some experience that and a perspective that might be different than yours as to how these rules might affect folks. This rule, as Senator Speaker Arch said, incorporates some of my suggestions, and we were just, as I was running over the mic, if you saw me coming over, was because I was attempting to continue to have a constructive conversation to address what was my initial concern and continues to be my concern. And this is why we should have a robust conversation about this. This seems like a really small rule. I think people want to just sort of go past it or glance over it because it applies to enrollment and review. And I know Senator Duncan touched on what enrollment and review is, the kind of technical changes that get made. And if you're an avid watcher of the legislature on television, you might not even really notice them. We have an enrollment and review chair who's Senator Ballard, is the youngest person in the newest class, is usually who it is. And a lot of times they just stand up and say, offer the amendment, and then we all vote on it and it gets accepted, and we move on, and there's very little conversation. And there have been, in recent instances, substantive amendments that have kind of jumped the line of other amendments to get in and use that E&R spot as a spot to make some amendments. And then, of course, there have been folks who we've taken up a lot of time and not gotten to the substantive debate necessarily as a result of kind of gumming up the E&R, enrollment and review, adoption. And so there's been some of that, and that's what this rule is seeking to change, is to say, we have to do this. This is kind of the, almost a ministerial function where if we're going to pass this law, it needs to be grammatically correct, it needs to be consistent. So, and sometimes we write these amendments on the floor. Everybody on the floor here, I probably still has one from Senator Conrad from last week with her handwriting on it. I've done many handwritten amendments on the floor, and then those get integrated into the bills and they need to be cleaned up. So that's, E&R is meant to just sort of clean things up, not make policy changes. But we've all talked about, there are those sorts of commas. We had a long conversation about commas last week and how that can change the meaning and intention of the rules, and more so in the law. A comma in the wrong place, a semicolon in particular, or ordering of the words, or a choice of shall and may, of course, makes a big difference. And so there's some really small changes that can have a very disproportionate impact on the intention of a bill. And anybody here who has drafted any number of bills might have gone through the same process I have with drafting, where it's an iterative process and you give them what you want, they send it back to you, and you say, this actually does the opposite of what I want. And then you have that conversation with them and they fix it. So it's not an ill intention necessarily, it's just perspective and interpretation. So what I'm trying to get to, I guess, is how I think it's still important to make sure we maintain an ability to amend the E&R outside of the normal course of debate. Because my concern about this proposed rule is that if we do have that instance where the E&R amendment,
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President, needs to be amended, and we have a true filibuster on that bill, a subsequently developed amendment that then gets filed after the E&R is filed will go to the back of the line behind all the other obstruction or filibuster amendments, and then never actually get a hearing, and will never then get adopted. And so we'll be stuck with so our options would be don't adopt the ENR, which makes the technical changes, or do adopt the ENR, which changes some nature and intention of the bill. So that's the conversation I was having off of the mic on trying to craft maybe some kind of small tweak that allows for that situation. But this is why I think it's important that we engage in this conversation, because seems very small. The ENR changes seem small, but they can have a disproportionate impact. The change in this rule seems small, but it could have lasting impacts that we need to make sure we have thought through and figured out a solution to that still allows us.
Time.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Raybould, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, fellow Nebraskans watching this debate on TV. I really thank Senator Duncan for bringing up a lot of questions. And I can tell you as a first-time senator, the ENR process is a little bit confusing, and I know we're diving into the weeds. But I do have a number of questions that I'm hoping Speaker Arch will be able to answer. I'm going to fire off all the questions, Speaker Arch, so you can hear them, and then I'll let you answer them if you're willing to take them on. So here's question number one. Who makes the determination that the changes in the E and R are substantive? Who makes the determination that they're purely technical? And then it sounds like we cannot introduce an amendment at the time of E and R. If so, is that correct? Can we introduce an amendment in this process? If not, I think Senator Kavanaugh just spoke about the fact that if we introduce the amendment, it's put at the end of the line of the amendments, even though they correct some of the substantive changes in the ENR process that members of the body feel are beyond the technical. And then what are some of the unintended consequences of changing this rule? And then Speaker Arch, can you give me an example of how we processed and handled this last year? Because the concept ENR approval was, it took a while to get my hands around what it means. And I know that there's some avid watchers out there that probably understand it better than I do, but if you wouldn't mind answering some of these questions.
Speaker Arch, will you yield to those questions?
Yes, I will.
You have 2 minutes, 52 seconds.
Okay, so Senator Raybould, the way that this proposed rule is drafted, I don't believe that it requires a determination whether they are technical or substantive. I know we had discussions about that at one time, and I think the end result was that's just unwieldy. I mean, your question is appropriate. Who could possibly make that could be technical to somebody, it could be substantive to someone else. And so I don't believe that it requires that. Can we introduce an amendment? Now, I will tell you that that's a question that is currently being discussed amongst some members is okay, so the primary introducer may be able to stand up and speak during the ENR amendment debate, or I should say, it's not a debate, but they are given that privilege to speak once. And they can introduce an amendment, but if there are already 10 amendments introduced on the bill, that amendment will fall to the bottom and may not get discussed. So we're having some discussions about, is there a way to allow for that? With regards to your other question regarding the problem, I guess I'll phrase it this way: what problem are we trying to address with this? And that is that the last couple years, this ENR amendment has quasi-introduced a new stage of debate. And so you may be waiting for the bill to come up, but with the ENR amendments as they are right now, things have been filed on ENR amendments that really are not technical in nature. They are substantive to the bill. And so it was jumping the line and making it more confusing the bill wasn't even up, and we were talking about the bill. And so we're just trying to streamline that process, get the ENR adopted, which really is a technical amendment, and get that ENR adopted so we can get to the bill. And there you can have your amendments, there you can debate the bill and not create another stage of debate with the ENR. Now, I would say this as well, that if members of the body have issues where revisers are doing more than just technical amendments and you have an issue with that, I would strongly encourage senators to go and sit down with the revisers and express their concern about that and bring specific examples that they could understand where they may see some issues with that. So I hope that answered most of your questions.
Yes, thank you, Speaker. I do have one
That's your time, Senator.
follow-up.
Thank you, Senator Arch. Thank you, Senator Raybould. Senator Erdman, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. So as I listen today and I hear the comment continue to be about bill drafting, I want to give a shout out to the bill drafters. These people work tirelessly to draft our bills, the 600-700 that we introduce and send up there. They are not intending to do anything to anyone's bill that senator doesn't want them to do. That's not their goal. And they intend to deliver to us correct information in the correct verbiage with the commas in the correct place, and they do an outstanding job. So I just want to say I appreciate what bill drafters do, and I thank them for their service. The other thing that comes to mind as I listen to this morning's debate is a lot of this is not about changing this rule, but it's more or less stalling and wasting time so they don't get to other rule changes. There has to be a better way to debate rule changes than the current method we are now using. Therefore, that is why when we wrote rule number 12, which is a total rewrite of the rules, we included rule number 12, which was a rule change on how to debate the rules. Because for those of you that aren't here and don't understand how you find the rule changes that we're discussing, they're in the journal. That is a difficult place to find rule changes. So with rule number 12 being changed and adopted, we would be able to look at those just like we do other bills, which would be very simple. But we don't like to make things simple here. We like to make them difficult. So I see the queue is full of people to talk about this amendment to the rules. And just so you know, for clarification for the youth back home trying to figure out what all these people are talking about is absolutely a little bit of nothing. Okay? So let's vote, let's move on. Let's make decisions that make this place better, function correctly, and more easily to understand. So don't be sidetracked if you're listening from home about what we're trying to do. It's plain and simple. We're wasting time. We've wasted enough time. It's time to move on. Change the rules so that makes it more convenient for all those who want to have real discussion, and we can vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Erdman. Senator McKinney, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of the recommit to committee, and I am against the rule change because I personally do not believe we should be changing rules in the middle of the session or the middle of the biennium. The effort to try to make things happen a lot easier in this body is what I'm just really against. If you have a controversial bill, go through the process, get the votes. That's what it's about. We shouldn't be changing the rules to make our lives easier because we want to pass things that affect the people of Nebraska. We should go through the normal process and get the votes to pass these things. We should not be trying to change the rules to not have long nights in the legislature. We should not be trying to change the rules to not go to sleep with a headache. We should not try to change the rules just to say we did something. It shouldn't happen. Yeah, nobody likes sitting here till 10 at night or late in the evening, but that's what we all signed up for, to be senators, to represent our districts, to fight for good legislation and to fight against bad legislation. But that doesn't mean we need to try to change the rules to make it easier for the majority to get things that they want to get across. I would be against this if I was in your position, honestly, because we are enacting things that affect people directly. And that is something you should think about. This doesn't just affect your life as a senator or your election or how you're perceived in the media or to your voters. It affects everyone in here. And it should take some time for you to hash out these ideas and these bills before they're passed. But to try to change the rules so somebody can't slow the process down is just wrong. And I know there's arguments for it because, well, we need to speed this up. We only have limited time, but we have limited time for a reason. Maybe some of these bills shouldn't come to the floor. That's something we should really think about. Maybe some of these bills should not come to the floor if we don't have enough time to pass them because they are that controversial. Let's have that conversation. But we should not be changing the rules at any time during this session. I know we already did some things, and I was against those as well, and I'm against the rest of the rule changes, basically on principle that we should not change the rules during the middle of a session. Y'all could disagree with me, but that's my opinion. I'm cool with staying here late at night if we are here late at night to fight against or fight for different legislation on behalf of our constituents in the rest of Nebraska. But I do not believe that our jobs should be made easier because people want to push through things that they probably don't have the votes for, or maybe not the votes, but we don't have time because it's going to be lengthy conversations about why the bill is good or bad. So that's just my opinion. I don't think we should be changing the rules right now. I tried to change the rules last year to, do some things against the prison that I think we should have did, because why did we vote as a body? Well, I didn't vote, but a lot of you did, to vote to build a prison, and they don't even want to demolish the current one that we have, the one that they ran around for 3+ years saying it was in such disarray that nobody could live there. But they don't want to demolish it. They want to decommission it, lower the custody level, and put people in there and still take taxpayer dollars and not change things in the criminal justice system. But again, we should not be changing rules in the middle of the biennium. So I'm for the recommit to committee, and I am against the rule change. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKinney. Senator Wayne, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I'm against all the rule changes. I'm not spending a whole lot of time. It appears that we're actually using the rules, which I find ironic because we have a rule change that will stop exactly what's going on here today. It'll stop the recommit from being done on every stage. It'll only be used like it is today, and then ask everybody to not vote for it, and then that won't happen any more time during debate, which I find interesting. Because then you can't use it again if the introducer wants to withdraw it or whatever thing else. Here's my problem with the E&R debates. We are eliminating emotion. And I know that doesn't sound like a whole lot of things, but we are basically saying people who are unelected are going to be able to write and make maybe substantive changes, and we have to first vote it in and then second vote to take it out. I find that interesting considering my first 2 years, I did a lot of cleanup bills in urban affairs. They were not substantive, but by this year, they would be considered substantive by this body because we changed the word from he to she or he or they. That is now a controversial issue, changing those words. There's also what we would consider modernizing or harmonizing the statute. So if you guys send a bill up for bill drafting and then you get a whole bunch of other changes that you didn't have in your original bill, that's because bill drafting has taken upon themselves over the years, and I don't knock them for it, to update the statutes where it seems to make grammatical changes or maybe make it flow better as you're reading it. The problem with those grammatical changes is you don't know if there's a court history based off of those grammatical changes. We pointed out last time the importance of a comma. We also, in technical cleanups, changed the word from and to or. That is a huge difference. And so what I'm telling you is you are going to vote on an E&R amendment that you have not read, that's going to have something in there that you do not agree with, and you're going to have to figure out how to vote to take it out. But more importantly, on your record, you will have voted for that bill. Unless you ask for a machine vote, it's considered passing unanimous. They don't score on select file the A's and the nays unless you ask for a machine vote. So what you're essentially saying is you cannot change or modify an E&R amendment before that vote. You are taking away your ability to read something and vote no on it. You can still vote no on it, technically, I guess, but we're saying there's no way to amend it to correct the language. I find that interesting. So I'm personally opposed to this because I think before I vote on anything, I should be able to read it. And if I want to amend anything on the board, I should be able to amend it. The reason these rule debates are moving along, even if one or two try to filibuster, is because there's somebody in the queue to call the question. They're going to show 5 hands. They're going to keep things moving. There is already a motion filed on this motion to suspend the rules. And I would submit to you that if we don't put that on the agenda, that is not a motion technically on the floor that doesn't require public notice. It is filed. It should require some type of agenda setting if it's already filed. If you're knowing you're going to suspend the rules, the public body should know if you're going to do that or not. It should be on the agenda. So I would argue against any suspension of the rules that is filed prior to the date of that suspending the rules. It's another thing when you're in debate and you're going down and you feel like it's been 6 hours and you file a motion to suspend the rules on the floor. We're talking about a motion to suspend the rules that's already filed. That should be on the agenda and we should have a debate. The problem that we're doing and what we are doing as a body is we are giving more power to the speaker. That was never the intent of this unicameral. It was to allow one or two to disrupt, because that disruption oftentimes brought compromise, or you just kind of roll them if you have the votes. That is the nature of our body. And believe me, I have gotten rolled plenty of times on this floor. But to start modifying these rules halfway through session because you can, or halfway through the biennium because you can, I just personally have a problem with that when there's going to be a whole set of new people in. I mean, at least
That's your time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Wayne. Senator DeBoer, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I first want to say that while we're talking about any potential need to possibly at some point amend the E&R amendments, I want to make it very clear to everyone in this room and to everyone that is watching, perhaps at home, that Bill Drafters does a very nice job. They do a very nice job. They don't make substantive changes just willy-nilly. They're not doing any of those kinds of things. I don't have a lot of problems that I've ever seen come up. Other senators have seen, they've seen an occasional one, but we're all human. Occasionally that might happen. I wanted to be very, very clear with everyone that bill drafters, when they do the E&R amendments, they aren't making a whole flurry of substantive changes. What you have heard from myself in the hearing and at other times, and perhaps from some of the others on the floor today, is that because we are all human, the possibility exists for needing to change E&R amendments. That is not a negative reflection on the people who are doing the E&R amendments. That is simply saying, because we are taking a vote, there needs to be a remedy to, if there is the occasional problem once every blue moon and a half for E&R amendments. So that is why they're trying to create a remedy in those rare occasions when something happens with E&R. But I want to talk to my colleagues who are newer here. One of the things that I learned in the hearing that I thought was sort of interesting is that E&R, it's not been that long since E&R was actually a pretty big deal committee. What we're seeing here with these E&R amendments on the floor is a kind of living archaeology in which our process over time, perhaps because of technology, perhaps I don't know why, has modified over time. The E&R chair used to be required to be a lawyer, and it was not that long ago that there was a vice chair of E&R, and that the vice chair of E&R was in fact the chair of the Judiciary Committee. So there was for a long time a process by which E&R amendments were overseen by members of this body. That was more than kind of the honorary position that it is today, where the youngest member of the newest class is automatically become E&R chair. You may have noticed that we don't vote for E&R chair at the beginning of the biennium because it is given to the youngest member of the newest class. It's almost like a hazing ritual in which Senator Ballard, before him Senator McKinney, becomes the chair. Before that, it was Senator Slama, and then I think it was maybe Senator Wishart was before that. The idea now is that they will stand up during select file and ask and motion for the E&R amendments to be accepted. This is part of our process that over time has slightly less meat to it than it originally did when we're talking about a committee and at least the chair and vice chair of the E&R committee working on those as well. So I voted for this change coming out of committee, the Rules Committee this year, in part because I think it recognizes that we're not in the same place that we used to be.
1 minute.
When, oh, okay. We're not in the same place that we used to be when we had the entire committee working, that sort of thing. So now I think we ought to get to a place where we can kind of smooth through this E&R change, but like everyone else has pointed out, we do want to make sure that elected officials are making the changes to our laws. So when that happens, we need to have some mechanism. So I am against the recommit to committee, but I'm open to a stronger mechanism for allowing an amendment if necessary in those rare circumstances when our rock star bill drafters happen to make a human mistake and there's something that needs to be changed. I'll come back on the mic and talk about the kinds of changes these are, because I think we're misunderstanding exactly the kinds of changes that E&R is making. These are not giant things. These are much smaller than that.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator DeBoer. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh announces a guest under the north balcony, Tessa Brooks, a senior at Marion High School in Omaha. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator Dungan, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I do rise today opposed to the recommit to committee motion. I always appreciate listening to Senator DeBoer talk. Living archaeology is a DeBoerism that I like a lot. I'll probably incorporate that into my vocabulary as well. But I think it's a good way of talking about sort of the evolution of the rules and what we've seen here. And I think what I want to start by pointing out is I would very respectfully disagree with my colleague, Senator Erdman. I do think for those watching at home and for those who are having any interest in the debate we're having, this is substantive. I do not believe that what we're talking about here is simply wasting time. And this is certainly not just an effort to elongate time. I think that it's been pointed out by a number of people here today that the proposed rule change 18 that modifies the debatability, the amendability of E&R or enrollment and review amendments is in fact very substantive. As I mentioned in my prior comments, you may want to change the E&R amendments and not get to it. Others have pointed out the need for debate about those things. And so I want to gently push back on the notion that what we're talking about here is not substantive. And I think that what this gets to is a broader debate that Senator McKinney and I believe Senator Wayne were also talking about what is the purpose of our debate in this body. I don't believe that things should be easy. Certainly, I'd like them to be easier sometimes. It'd be a lot easier to get some bills passed from time to time. But at the end of the day, what we do in this body should be difficult. We were sent here to answer the hard questions and to have the difficult debates. And I think that the notion that we should adopt rules simply to make it more convenient is very problematic. I absolutely agree with the speaker when he got up and said at the beginning of this session that rules are guardrails that are intended to keep debate on a certain path. But the notion that those rules should make it easy for individuals to get something done, I think, is slightly flawed. We should be having conversations about the rule changes to make sure we're not missing anything, because there have been rules that have been adopted in the past by this body that have had unintended consequences. And certainly I think it is because some rules have been passed previously without thinking about what's going to happen in the future that we've seen some problems arise because there wasn't actual debate. And so that's why I rise again today to talk more about Rule Change 18 and specifically to push back on that idea that this is just a waste of time. Senator John Kavanaugh has been working with the speaker along with many others tirelessly, I think, to make sure that these rules achieve the intended goal without necessarily getting us off of what the actual hope of these rules are. And so I do appreciate the efforts that are going into that. And part of the reason that I think some people are talking right now is to allow there to be time for those amendments to be drafted, amendments that are substantive in nature and amendments that I would probably urge my colleagues to vote for once we actually see the language in those, assuming they achieve the intended goal. And so I do, again, rise today in tentative support of proposed rule change 18. I do understand that what we're talking about is the hypothetical amendments to ENR, which are technical in nature, but any modification that's made that could be perceived as substantive or could potentially have an overarching change in the execution of the law or the interpretation of the law, I think should be amendable. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to get some amendment here in the near future that allows the amendment of ENR prior to its adoption. I think that would answer a number of the questions we've had, and it would also achieve the goal of keeping debate on track. Because if an ENR amendment is if you can amend an ENR amendment prior to its adoption, but it's not maybe necessarily debatable, that would achieve, I think, both goals. So thank you, Mr. President. There's plenty of room here for a change. I think that part of the reason we're having this conversation is because, frankly, I hadn't thought of a number of these issues with this proposed rule change prior to the last couple of days as I was reviewing these. I know our Rules Committee talked about them ad nauseum, but it's not until these rules make their way to the greater body that I think we can really finally work through all of the issues that may arise if they're implemented. So, colleagues, please, please, please pay attention. Please listen to this debate. I think this is us trying to get to the heart of a number of the issues that are being debated here. These are, in fact, real conversations. We're not just stalling for time. So please listen to the amendments that come up, consider how they affect the actual rules, and please pay attention to the conversation we're having, because I think it really matters. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dungan. Mr. Clerk, for items and new bills.
Thank you, Mr. President. Letter from Senator Hardin informing the body that he's chosen LB 1120 as his personal priority. Senator Hardin, 1120 personal priority bill for the session. Notice committee hearings from the Health and Human Services Committee as well as the Urban Affairs Committee. And a motion from Senator Brewer to be printed in the Journal to withdraw Legislative Bill 973. New bills, Legislative Bill 1196, introduced by Senator Ballard, is bill for an act relating to public health and welfare, amend Section 716726, change provisions relating to the registration of medical aids, and repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1197, introduced by Senator Von Gillen, is bill for an act relating to the Sports Arena Facility Financing Assistance Act, amend Section 133102, 0304, and 08. Defines and redefines terms, change provisions relating to the use of state assistance applications, certain limitation on state assistance, harmonized provisions, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1198, introduced by Senator Mosier, is bill for an act relating to county records. Amend Section 233211, provides for withholding the residential address of a county attorney or deputy county attorney from the public, and repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1199, introduced by Senator Mosier, is bill for an act relating to the Department of Natural Resources. Amend Section 46296, repeals certain administrative fees relating to the Department of Natural Resources, harmonized provisions, repeals the original section, outright repeals Section 33105. Legislative Bill 1200, introduced by Senator Mosier, is bill for an act relating to motor vehicles, amend Sections 18, 17, 37, 43, 33, 14, 33, 18, 61, 40, 16401, 6172, 63, 162, 63, 202, 205, 6480, 64, 7901, 64, 131, 13101, 139, 134, 14403, 14601, 148, 14801, 149, 150, 151, 60-6 to 53, 66 to 54, section 6144, 6146, 149, 63, 198, 6490, and section 30, 24, 127, 6107, 611901, 169, 30201, 3301, 33601, 6386, 631304, 19301, 462, 46201, 47901, 1101, 64, 115, 4, 132, 4, 134, 142, 144, 14702, 168, 6501, 66, 2801, 66, 265, 6270, 2705, 290901, 75, 363, 75, 364, 366, 36903, 392, and 393 adopts and updates federal law on certain update certain federal references, change of provision like certificates title under the Nebraska Probate Code, delivery of certain notifications relating to Operator's License, Motor Vehicle Certificate Act, Title Act, Motor Vehicle Registration Act, the Motor Vehicle Operator's License Act, the Nebraska Rules of the Road, changes certain penalties, eliminates obsolete provisions, harmonizes provisions, repeals the original section, and declares emergency. Legislative Bill 1201, introduced by Senator Hardin. It's a bill for enacting education amendments, Section 791101 and 791103, Section 791003. Redefines terms under the Tax Equity and Educational Opportunity Support Act, change provisions relating to early childhood education grant program, changes legislative intent relating to early childhood education programs, harmonize provisions, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1202, introduced by Senator Holleran, is a bill for an act relating to child support enforcement, amends sections 43, 33, 4204, changes the requirement relating to customer service unit, and repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1203, introduced by Senator John Kavanaugh, is a bill for an act relating to Nebraska Political and Accountability and Disclosure Act, amends section 491403 and section 491401, defines terms, regulates the use of qualified political advertisements and distribution of material deceptive media relating to artificial intelligence, provides exemptions, provides for injunctive relief, harmonized provisions, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1204, introduced by Senator John Kavanaugh, is a bill for enacting the Nebraska Liquor Control Act, amends section 53-12301 and section 53-101, 53-103, 123-16. Defines Rick House, authorizes a holder of a micro distillery license and a holder of a manufacturer's license to operate a Rick House as prescribed, provides powers and duties of the Nebraska Liquor Control Commission, harmonized provisions, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1205, introduced by Senator Hughes, a bill for enacting appropriations, appropriates federal funds to the Department of Natural Resources and declares an emergency. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator Frederickson, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Nebraskans. I continue to be interested in the discussion we're having this morning regarding the rules, specifically the proposed rule change number 18 by Speaker Arch. I supported the two rule changes that we voted on last week. I'm going to continue to listen to the arguments on both sides for this. I actually disagree that this conversation is happening just for take up time or to waste time. I think that, this is actually a very substantive conversation. I certainly, as a new member of this body, am learning quite a bit on the rules and the different mechanisms of the rules and why we have the rules and how to utilize the rules. So I think it's prudent for especially new members of the body to listen and learn the rules as best as we possibly can. As I said, the current debate we're having is on proposed rule change 18, which is going to impact specifically enrollment and review. It says that this is not a debatable, amendable motion. Senator Wayne made some really, I think, intriguing points earlier about this, particularly if there is, in fact, a genuine need to amend E&R motions. So that's something that I do have a little bit of concern on. I mean, essentially what would happen in that case is that we would go to a vote without any amendments, and then we'd have to perhaps vote no on the E&R amendments, only to actually then change them and amend them. And if anyone in here who knows, if you're trying to whip votes to get something to happen, it can be like herding cats at times. So I think trying to corral everyone to vote no on an E&R amendment, which is typically just a no-brainer, it's a yes, because as Senator DeBoer said earlier, the bill drafters, typically do an incredible job on those, but there is always room for human error. So I think the fact that we have to vote no on that only to come back could be a little bit of a hiccup as opposed to just simply amending before we get to a vote. So that's kind of my shtick with this one so far. Speaking of, this is actually Senator DeBoer is speaking with the speaker right now. I see she's busy, but I actually had a question for her. She was talking a little bit earlier on the mic regarding different changes that have come to ENR. I don't know if she's available for a question. I think probably not. So I will actually ask Senator Conrad this question if she's so willing to yield as a senior member of the body.
Senator Conrad, are you willing to yield to a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. I'm wondering if you might be willing to maybe kind of shed some global points on ENR amendments, historical context thereof, and what concerns you might have about this proposed rule change.
Yes, thank you so much, Senator. And I think that there has been some good foundation laid in regards to how this component of our process has worked historically and in the present sense. But I think one thing that you can hear some tension amongst or some differences of opinion arising from different members is that, while yes, E&R is meant to be more technical in nature, sometimes it's a blurry line between what's a technical an amendment and what is a substantive amendment, recognizing even grammatical changes or punctuation can have substantive impact. So it's a little bit of art, a little bit of science, perhaps in the eye of the beholder. But that being said, while E&R is meant to provide technical corrections as a measure moves its way through the legislative process, it has been utilized by different people at different times to raise important issues. And I do
1 minute.
have a great deal of concern about overcorrecting in terms of changing the E&R process, because I do think that it could have negative impacts when it comes to substantive changes. And I do think that the technical aspects sometimes do provide an opportunity or a speed bump when things are going too quickly or too fast to jump in. That has happened historically in our body, not just over the last few years. And so it's something that I think we need to think very carefully about, even though it sounds very archaic, like debating the nuances of an enrollment and review measure. But it is an important and integral part of our process that goes to both substance and technical issues.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad and Senator Frederickson. Senator Conrad, you're next in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I want to, before turning to the specific issues on the board, want to just respond and provide another perspective in terms of where we are, how we got here, and where we're going to be moving forward together today, this week, and through the remainder of the session. And I would like to provide a different perspective than the one provided by my friend Senator Erdman earlier in the debate this morning. It has been very clear from Senator Arch and Senator Erdman that they were both seeking significant rules changes, some to strengthen the institution and some in direct reaction to the contentious session that we had last year. And some of the components put forward are not even related to the contentious session that we had last year, but rather perennial issues for those that seek to undermine the unique attributes of the nonpartisan unicameral system. So I do want to note a couple of things so that it is clear for the record. If you go back and you look at who brought forward a significant amount of rule changes, it was not myself. It was not other members who hold more progressive viewpoints in regards to how they approach their work in the body. There was a significant amount of rules put forward by Senator Erdman and Senator Arch, a few put forward by Senator Kavanaugh and a few put forward by Senator Wayne. But to stand up and say we're frustrated that we're taking times on rules, that lies very squarely at those who introduced the amendments and initiated the process. Additionally, we have not filed copious motions. We have not filed copious amendments on the rules that have been put forward from the committee. Those of us in the minority or progressive or moderate kind of political, ideological camps do not have the power to set the agenda. So the reason that we're here, the reason that we're taking time is because Senator Erdman has asked the body to take time by introducing a copious amount of rules changes, by putting out a copious amount of rules changes, by putting forward contentious rules changes that we have only, as those of us in the minority perspective, the ability to stand witness to, the ability to vote on, the ability to engage in dialogue on. That's it. So if Senator Erdman does not want to take additional times on rules or is bothered by a deliberative process, he has only his choice about whether or not to introduce them or to pull them so that we can move on to full and fair debate on key issues impacting Nebraskans like childcare, like workforce, like targeted tax relief, like keeping our public schools strong. Any one of us would happily join with that effort and would respectfully ask that he remove those from consideration so that we can move forward with robust debate on issues that matter to Nebraskans. Another piece that I would like to put forward that I do have a different perspective with my friend Speaker Arch. And when he was opening on this specific amendment, he indicated that perhaps this had recently become a problem. And again, I disagree. I think that the utilization of technical changes, of course, and substantive changes has always been part and parcel with our process. Thank you, Mr. President, in the Nebraska Legislature. So I don't think this is a brand new problem that must be solved. It is also equally available to all senators that feel strongly about matters that are moving forward. I will go back and triple check the record, but it's my understanding there's 2 high-profile examples of how E&R amendments were utilized that would be subject to change in the rule that is pending. I believe Senator Slama utilized amendments on E&R motions when she was waging a filibuster against the voter ID measure. And I think other members utilized E&R amendments to lift substantive debate on matters like LB 626, an abortion ban that came before the body. So those processes have been utilized throughout our history, including last year, by members with very, very different points on the political spectrum. So it's important that, thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I would echo a lot of the sentiments just shared by Senator Conrad about this rules debate and the idea that we're just taking time to take time. Many of us have expressed our disagreement over these sweeping rules changes mid-biennium. It is a 60-day session. We could be debating carryover bills. We could be debating bills that have already been placed on general file and given a priority. There's a lot of things we could be doing, and none of that was my choice. The scheduling, the introduction of rules, if you didn't want to waste time, you shouldn't have introduced rules that waste time. And I think it was pretty clear from the onset that I opposed these rules changes. So if you're, I don't know, dismayed that I'm standing up and speaking in opposition to these rules changes and taking precious time in a 60-day session, you should look in the mirror and blame yourself because you decided to do this. I did not. I've been very clear about where I stand on rules changes mid-biennium. This particular rules change, however, interestingly, is not about me. I believe it's about Senator Reapy, actually, because he tried to amend on E&R the abortion ban, and we couldn't have that. We could not have that go to 12 weeks instead of the 6 weeks until we could, to force him to vote for 574. So this is in reaction to restricting women's rights to reproductive health, not to the filibuster of election. Just to be clear. And when we do something in a reactionary way, there are consequences. And these consequences might not seem significant or severe at this moment in time, but we are eroding our own voice. We are eroding free speech. We are eroding democracy when we make these changes. So let's play this out. We make this change to E&R. You can't debate E&R anymore. Or even better, one person, the introducer of the bill, can speak on E&R. Now, the next time we have rules changes, what is to stop the next legislature or the next from changing other debate rules to limit who is allowed to speak on that change? What is to stop other legislatures from saying in the future, this legislature thought it was okay to restrict the debate at this moment in debate to one person? Why don't we do that on other rounds of debate? Why don't we restrict debate on committee amendments to one person? What is to stop this continued erosion from happening? And what is the reason for this erosion? This is in reaction to Senator Riepe trying to get his amendment heard when people were stopping him from getting his substantive amendment to have its time of floor debate. Now, I wasn't going to vote for his amendment. I did not support his amendment. I did not support the underlying bill, but I understood that he was working in good faith to try to get to his amendment, and this body was blocking his amendment. So he used the tools available to him, as one should. But now we're going to take that tool away. Now let's talk about when we take tools away, how that's going to impact the rest of you. There will be a time where some of you will need the tools that are in the rule book, whatever those tools are. And I guarantee with these sweeping changes that we are enacting this year, there will be some of you this year that sure will regret that. There will be a moment in time where you have a bill that you are either fighting or you are fighting for, and these changes are going to hinder your ability to achieve your own goals. But you're not thinking about that. You're only thinking about last session. You're not thinking about the future and how to protect the institution and how to protect the voice of your voters.
That's your time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator John Kavanaugh, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, again, those who are paying attention, there's a lot of activity going on, and it's because folks are talking about this particular bill or this particular rule proposal and proposed changes to this rule proposal. And as I said earlier, when Speaker Arch proposed his group of rules, I saw this one and I said, oh, well, I think there's a problem with this. So I made a proposal, which was one of the two rules that I proposed to the Rules Committee. And then ultimately what they kicked out is this Rule 18 as you see it in front of you. And it contemplates some of my suggestions and some of what Speaker Arch proposed, and then some of the things that came out in committee or in their conversations. And so that's, again, another kind of iterative process about these amendments. And now we have, everybody here. I kind of came in today and I started talking to the speaker about other ways that I didn't think that this particular version fully integrates my suggestions, which are that I've talked about ensuring that there is an actual opportunity in those rare instances to make changes to the ENR amendment when necessary. And what we're finding is any sort of minor tweak and change to that has a different impact. So, what is the physics? All actions have an equal and opposite reaction. It's kind of like what we're talking about here is that we make a small tweak to try to allow for this outlet to actually make a necessary amendment that could kick the door open to have the same sort of issues that the other Senator Kavanaugh was just talking about and that some folks are trying to curtail. However, if you don't have that outlet, you run into a potentially problematic situation where, bill could change the intention of the bill, as Senator Wayne talked about. And so that's where we're having a real substantive, though minutia-laden conversation off the microphone about rules. But it is a substantive conversation that needs to be had. And again, this has been my original opposition to changing the rules at this point, is that I don't think that we should be changing them at this point. But if we're going to do it, we should make sure we do it right. And we should certainly not do it out of a place of retaliation and anger about what happened last year, because then we run the risk of creating a situation, hemming ourselves in or putting ourselves in a situation that is hard to fix. And these are some problems that you might say, well, how often does it happen? Well, a lot of things don't happen that often, but you want to be ready for when they do. A lot of folks, I don't know if anybody else traveled this weekend, had our flights canceled. I was traveling and my flight got canceled. Doesn't happen that much. I've flown lots of times, a number of times that my flight's been canceled. I think, I can count on one hand. But I needed to get home to my kids and needed to get back here so I could be here to share this wonderful conversation with you all. But you want to have contingencies for that, right? When the airlines aren't ready for that eventuality that happens to them more often because they're flying every day. But you want to be ready for the always possible, however unlikely, rare problem. And that's what we're talking about with this rule, is to make sure that we have an opportunity to take corrective action when necessary, so that we don't either create chaos or create
1 minute.
bills that have problems stuck in them, either inserted into them or problems not fixed because of we've hamstrung ourselves. And to echo Senator Erdman's comments from earlier, I'm not intending to attack or malign drafting in any way. I think they do a fantastic job. It's a Herculean effort, especially at this point in time. And what we just need to understand is they're doing a great job and they have the best of intentions. But again, they are operating from a perspective where they may look at a bill and say, oh, this needs a comma here. We're going to put it there because that would be grammatically correct. But in some instances, putting a comma somewhere does change the actual intention, and the intention of the introducer might be so affected by having that comma there, and they wouldn't want the bill if it makes that change. I have a bill that I'm working on right now where I'm wrestling with where to put a semicolon and how much it will change how
That's
that bill
your
will
time,
actually go into
Senator.
effect. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator DeBoer, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Okay, as promised, I was going to come back and talk about the kinds of changes that these E&R amendments are. So one of the things that we kind of all gloss over in our brains is that we have a bill before us, and it comes out with what we call the green copy because it's originally printed on green paper. And maybe there's a committee amendment, which we call a white copy amendment because it's printed on white paper. And what that does is it completely replaces whatever's in the green. But you can only do that by amending that with the committee amendment. Great. So what happens here is that when we go and vote on general file to put in the committee amendment, and then a random amendment that comes from the floor, and then maybe there's an introducer's amendment, there is no document that exists anywhere that takes that green copy and puts in those amendments in such a way that they're all part of one big thing, which is what we vote on to move forward in general file. We're basically voting on an idea, not an actual piece of paper or words that exist anywhere. What E&R does is they take the committee amendment plus the introducer's amendment plus the floor amendment, and they smash them together in a way that gets at what everyone's trying to do. And sometimes that means it's seamless. There's no problem. You just put the one in, they've written it, it's all seamless, it all goes together. There's no imperfections where you're actually a subpart B instead of a subpart A now, or you move things around. Sometimes it's seamless, and sometimes it's not seamless. Sometimes there's a subpart 1 and subpart 2 and subpart 3 that now with some new language gets moved down. E&R amendments then changes it from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, so that they move it down in the order of the list, which is what's supposed to happen because that's what the body voted to have happen, but we don't have the language anywhere that does that. Maybe we just have the amendment that says subpart 1 shall now be this, but now we haven't taken old subpart 1 and made it part 2. These are E&R amendments. If it sounds technical, that's because it is. If it sounds like a job you would like, hey, I think they're hiring if you're a lawyer. Otherwise, for the rest of us, this is a situation where, because they've made all these little tiny changes, they do what's called a white copy amendment. So the idea of what we pass on general file doesn't exist anywhere except in all of our 49 heads plus whatever everyone else is keeping track of. The actual fruition of it, where we have to change subpart number 2, 3, 4, and 5 to reflect that we're moving them down 1, isn't on paper. E&R makes it happen. E&R makes everything work out so it looks right. So, to try to say we're only going to undo the E&R changes, you might end up with 2 subpart 2s. These are the kinds of things that we should not be doing. So I'm going to, notwithstanding the fact that we're taking away a remedy for if there's ever a mistake, balance the probability that we're going to screw something up if we don't take the white copy E&R amendments against the possibility that on some occasion that could cause some problem. And I'm going to say, if we're changing this rule, and I'm okay with it, because I don't think these are the things that we should be spending our time debating. I think we should debate the actual bill. So if I'm okay with it, I think we have to do this without trying to muck around. I tried several ways to make it work, and the problem is, because of the very nature of what we're talking about, we can't amend this to do what Senator Kavanaugh, although a good concern, is worried about. The balance says to vote for this, so I'm going to vote against the recommit to committee, and I'm going to vote for the rule change as sent out of the Rules Committee, because on balance, although there is the danger of not being able to amend the E&R amendments, it is better to have the E&R amendments go out with all their technical changes than to try to mess around with them in some sort of haphazard or partial way. So.
That's your time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator DeBoer. Senator Dungan, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I still rise opposed to the motion to recommit to committee. Still having a conversation with many of my colleagues around the room as we talk about what modifications could be made to this, what modifications should be made to this. And I know there's still some conversations happening amongst my colleagues regarding possible amendments. And so I just wanted to give them a little bit more time to have those conversations and discuss a little bit more some of the concerns and larger perspectives that people have brought up with regard to the rule change. I would once again reiterate that I think the fact that in the course of the few hours we've been debating this morning, it's only been about an hour and a half, there have already been so many substantive conversations with my colleagues over here and the speaker about potential issues with this rule or issues that could crop up with certain amendments to this rule, lends itself to the general idea and notion that these debates are substantive in nature. And so I just want to highlight again that I think the conversation we're having is one that is interesting to me. I do like getting into the minutia of the rules, and I think it's important that we as a body continue to have these conversations to make sure that we all understand how these work. I also think, and I think one of the other senators who spoke earlier mentioned this briefly, it's actually helpful to have these discussions about the rules for newer senators like myself. One of the things they say when you first come into the body is they want you to read the rule book, or you should read the rule book time and time again. But even when you do that, it's not until you actually get into the legislature that you actually functionally understand how these things operate. And so I think having these debates and having these conversations around the modification of the rules allows freshman senators like myself and also other senators who aren't as familiar with some of the procedures on the floor to have the chance to really dive in and get how these work and how they're intended to operate. I probably am in support of proposed rule change 18. I think, again, the speaker and others who have worked on this in the Rules Committee have tried to address a real problem, which is ensuring that debate remains substantive and that we don't have issues with E&R being modified in a way that causes further confusion. That being said, I do, again, still have concern with the current phrasing of this rule. If we don't change it, it could ultimately prohibit modifications to E&R amendments that are necessary or are important. And so my hope would be that we would have an opportunity to see an amendment to this rule that would potentially allow for limited debate on E&R, that could potentially allow for a limited debate followed by a vote, on the E&R amendments themselves, and then move on to other substantive amendments. I think that would address a lot of the problems. I think it could also present its own slew of problems, as I think Senator DeBoer and others have pointed out. But these are the reasons we have these conversations. We want to make sure we actually understand what the problems could be as they crop up. And I was talking with a former senator last week about some rule changes that had happened back in the 1970s. And I received some commentary, without going into detail about what it was, regarding some changes that had been made in the late 70s and what the unintended consequences were of that change. And I think it's really important to have that historical perspective when we're talking about the rule changes. Sometimes we make a change that's well-intentioned, but rather than actually have a conversation about what the possible outcomes could be, it just happens, again, maybe to make things more convenient. And then ultimately you see this real problem crop up in the next biennium. And so I think that although I do probably, again, tentatively support Rule Change 18, the points being made by Senator McKinney and others of my colleagues about the possibility of consequences to these rule changes should be listened to by my colleagues, and we should not be making these changes lightly.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. So when it comes to E&R amendments, I would agree and echo the sentiment from a number of my colleagues that the bill drafters do a fantastic job. We've been working very closely with them for the last few months, trying to get everything sort of lined up to drop our bills. None of this is intended in any way, shape, or form to speak poorly on bill drafters. But I do think it's important for us to maintain oversight as a legislative body when we are talking about amendments. And I think it's important for us as a legislative body to ensure the quality of our work product when it comes to amendments on bills. As such, I think having some possibility to modify E&R in a limited fashion would maybe be beneficial, and I look forward to possibly seeing amendments to that effect. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Duncan. Senator McKinney, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise for the motion to recommit to committee and against the rule change. And I was sitting here thinking, and a lot of times people get on the mic and start speaking words about preserving the institution, and the institution is sacred and we can't do things to erode the institution for whatever reason. Well, no, not the last 2 years. Institution has been further eroded, and it's going to happen again when all these rules changes are implemented. And, I was thinking to myself, as somebody from a community that hasn't got the best hand at a stick or anything like that, maybe the institution needs to be eroded because the institution has never cared about my community historically. But, I'm in this body right now, and I'm sticking to principle as well that I don't think we should be changing rules in the middle of session or in the middle of a biennium. Like Senator Duggan was just speaking, we're not even thinking about the unintended consequences. We're just rolling these through and not thinking about the future of what could happen. How could this negatively affect us moving forward? Because once we implement new rules, changing those new rules are going to be hard. And they probably will never be changed, maybe adjusted a little bit, but once you change things in this place, it's hard to change them back. It's just like somebody trying to, create a new felony or a new offense. Once you do that, the county attorneys will never let you take it back. That's why we fight against those, which is also why we should fight against rules changes, because once you change them and you realize that they're bad, the possibility of getting those changed is kind of slim to none. We don't know what the makeup of this body is going to be in the future. So, why should we be doing things that could have negative impact, especially on the minority, limiting the minority's voice and limiting the way the minority could stand up against things that are not good, or limiting the minority from standing up for things that are good. This is why we don't change the rules in the middle of a session. Our lives shouldn't be made easier because we had a session that nobody liked. Maybe we should keep things inside of committees that should stay in committees. Maybe we should just be willing to do the hard work to pass our bills. There are no shortcuts in life. There shouldn't be shortcuts in the legislature. I was just coaching at a tournament yesterday and just talking to the kids, like, y'all have to put in the work. You can't just show up on Saturday, step on the mat, and expect to win. You have to do the work. There are no shortcuts, and there shouldn't be any shortcuts in the legislature because we had a hard session last year. Because nobody wants to stay to 10 or midnight. That, I really don't understand it, but I do understand it, because if you have the power, I guess you wield it and run over people and kick and stump them. Had a conversation with kids about that last year.
1 minute.
Had the conversation on the mic. But, hopefully you guys are listening. I'm not sure if people are, but we shouldn't be changing the rules in the middle of a session, in the middle of a biennium, because we had a hard session. We deal with people's lives that directly affect them, whether good or bad, and you should have to work for it. You shouldn't be able to just slide by because you have the power to change the rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKinney. Senator Conrad, you're recognized to speak, and this is your third opportunity on the motion to recommit.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good day, friends. I wanted to continue my discussion of kind of where we are, how we got here, where we're headed, and then talk a little bit more specifically about this proposed rule change in regards to the enrollment and review process and how that interfaces with the legislative process more generally. But I also wanted to note again that senators, including myself, did not bring forward copious amounts of rules changes. We literally worked in good faith with external stakeholders to keep the noise down, to reset the tone, to not pack the hearings, to be thoughtful and deliberative in terms of our approach, and expended great political capital to do so because it was the right thing to do. We didn't put in a bunch of rules changes. We didn't pack the hearings. We haven't filed copious motions and amendments. But there are a significant amount of rules changes that have been brought forward by Senator Erdman and by Speaker Arch, and then a few put forward by Senator John Kavanaugh and Senator Wayne, as I understand things. So that's why we're here. And to my friend Senator McKinney's point of view, and I think Senator Michaela Kavanaugh has made a similar statement in regards to where we find ourselves in the rules debate this year, I completely respect and understand their principled and appropriate approach that the best course of action, the ideal outcome, is not to change the rules in the middle of a biennium, because I don't think the rules necessarily were the issue or the problem in terms of the contentious nature of last year's session. That being said, while I respect and understand their perspective wholeheartedly and their right to advocate for such, looking at the challenging landscape that we find ourselves within, I don't think that there's enough support within the body to effectuate that goal. So I'm trying to think about this from a pragmatic perspective. Even if I share their principled approach that we should not change the rules in the middle of the biennium, I don't think that there's enough support there in the body. So looking at the alternatives, I'm looking at radical changes to the unique nature of the unicameral system put forward by Senator Erdman, and I'm looking at more modest, measured approaches put forward to codify precedents, make technical updates, and modernize and strengthen the institution put forward by Speaker Arch. And then I'm weighing those alternatives from a pragmatic perspective. And so that's why, on the whole, while I agree with Senator Michaela Cavanaugh and Senator McKinney, I am more inclined to support the measures that Speaker Arch has brought forward in good faith that have enjoyed broad support at the Rules Committee hearing from the Second House and from a very diverse set of members of the Rules Committee. Most of these came out 5-0. I don't love them, including this ENR change and the order of amendments that we'll talk more about later today, hopefully. But I'm inclined to either support them or at least not fight them with every tool in the tool bag, recognizing there's more significant threats to the process and the institution later to come this week that again were brought forward by Senator Erdman to provoke this lengthy discussion. So thank you, Mr. President. The last piece that I want to just lift in terms of E&R amendments is I disagree with my friend Speaker Arch when he said that filing substantive amendments to the ENR prevented thoughtful debate. I completely disagree with that. That's not how our process works at all. Whether amendments are filed to ENR or committee amendments or standalone amendments or white copy, you look at the board and we work up the board and we talk about whatever we seek to talk about that's germane in regards to the measure. So nothing prevents a member from talking about the underlying bill if something's filed to ENR. It has never worked that way. It won't work that way. It shouldn't work that way as the only deliberative body in the state. There is no restriction on speech or substance of debate or dialogue, regardless of where the motion or the amendment is filed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. A lot of activity this morning, which is always kind of fun. So normally I like to sit and listen as much as possible to the floor debate. I've been a little distracted this morning because I have a guest here and just also talking off the mic with individuals about what we're trying to accomplish. And so I apologize that I'm not as keyed into what everyone else has been saying. So bear with me if I repeat anybody else's points. Is essentially what I'm trying to say. I do want to note for those watching at home, and I heard I was a little bit late coming in this morning. My kids had late start, but I was listening as I was driving in, and I heard Senator Conrad talk about the difficulty of people who are watching at home. So I did take a picture of the proposed rules change 18, and I posted it on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, so that people can take that and they can share it on their own social media. And I will, to the best of my ability, try to share any amendments or proposed rules changes that come across my desk today on social media, pretty much sharing them without comment, just public information out there for you. So, so if you are trying to look at what we're looking at, that's where it is. Or I suppose I don't know if the media is getting a copy of these or not. Are you getting a copy of these as they come in? No. So maybe I should give you a copy so you can tweet them as well or X them. I don't know what the term is with X. Are you Xing them? Xing. I don't know. Anyways. For the historical record of transcribers, I am talking about social media platforms. Who knows if any of them will exist whenever somebody reads this in the future, but X is what used to be Twitter, and we used to tweet, and now I don't know what we do on X, but if you type in Twitter currently, you still get to Twitter/X. I wonder when that's going to change, but anywho, sorry, I digress, as I am wont to do. So, what this amendment is doing is striking a motion to approve or reject any or all of the changes recommended by the chairperson of enrollment and review. Seems okay, because then we actually are still going to approve or reject the motion, but we go further to say that it is not debatable, amendable, nor divisible prior to its initial adoption, except that the primary introducer may be recognized to speak for 5 minutes prior to the vote on enrollment and review amendments. And I will say, while I oppose all rules changes, and I appreciate, because again, I did listen to Speaker Arch talk about why he put in that 5 minutes prior, but here's the reason that I oppose that, and I forgot, I need to grab. So last week, when we were debating proposed rule change 25, Senator Wayne and myself found substantive grammatical changes that needed to be made and were ultimately made and adopted by this body. Now, this rules change on select file assumes that only the introducer of the bill will find these things. And I think it is fair to say that I am a bit hawkish about bills and process and legislation in this body. And I oftentimes come across things that might have not been noticed by the introducer of a bill. And so, as was the case with Senator Wayne and myself on Rule Change 25. It went through the committee process, it came to the floor, it was debated, and it's still singular senators found the changes. So only putting the power into one person's hands to identify and debate what change needs to be made, I find problematic. And Again, I don't think I have enough time, and we're probably going to be wrapping up on this motion shortly. So I will continue this conversation about this next time around, because I feel truncated at this moment. So thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Speaker Arch, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also wanted to just let people know we've been having some very substantive discussions on a possible amendment to this, and the amendment discussion surrounded the issue of while in our present proposed rule change, we have the primary introducer having the ability to speak 5 minutes. It could be at some point difficult to bring up an amendment to adjust that. But that being said, we weren't able to land on language without creating other issues, and so we're not introducing that. I would ask this, that we're coming up on the noon hour here. I would like a vote on recommit to committee before noon, at which time we can break and resume our debate after lunch. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Speaker Arch. See no one else in the queue. Speaker Arch, you're recognized to close.
Just a reminder, colleagues, I would like a no vote on recommit to committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker Arch. Members, the question is the motion to recommit the rule change on Rule 6, Section 5. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. Record, Mr. Clerk.
1A, 35 nays on the motion to recommit, Mr. President.
The motion to recommit fails. Mr. Clerk, next item.
Mr. President, some items quickly. New bills. Legislative Bill 1206, introduced by Senator Arch, the bill for an act relating to revenue and taxation amendment, Section 772716, elimination provisions related to long clear term care savings plan act to permanent harmonized provisions, repeal section, I repeal Section 776101, 6102, 0304, 05, and 06. Legislative Bill 1207, introduced by Senator Albright, is a bill for enacting the Nebraska Agricultural Products Marketing Act, amend sections 23804, redefines the term and repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1208, introduced by Senator Boston, is a bill for enacting the Nebraska Juvenile Code, amend section 4325101, provides for detention of a juvenile for protection of such juvenile, eliminates obsolete provisions, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1209, introduced by Senator Boston, it's a bill for enacting relating to appropriations to appropriate funds to the Department of Health and Human Services, declare an emergency. Legislative Bill 1210, introduced by Senator Clements, a bill for enacting relating to appropriations, among section 84612, states legislative intent to appropriate funds to the Department of Administrative Services for the Office of Nebraska Capital Commission, provides for transfer from the cash reserve fund, repeals the original section, declares emergency. Legislative Bill 1211, introduced by Senator Hansen, is a bill for enacting relating to elections, amend section 32808 and section 32942, changes the deadline for delivery of ballots for early voting, changes how early a registered voter may vote in person, repeals the original section, declares emergency. Legislative Bill 1212, introduced by Senator Walls, a bill for an act relating to railroads, and section 75-10901, adopts the Railroad Safety Act, eliminates obsolete provisions related to blocked crossings, harmonized provisions, provides an operative date, repeals the original section, outright repeals section 17225. Legislative Bill 213, introduced by Senator Walls, a bill for an act relating to labor, requires employers to provide 20 hours of paid leave for attendance at school-related activities of employees' family members and defines terms. Legislative Bill 1214, introduced by the Health and Human Services Committee, is a bill for an act relating to the Uniform Credentialing Act, amend section 38131, change requirements to relating to a criminal background check as prescribed and repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1215, introduced by Senator Hansen, is a bill for an act relating to the Department of Health and Human Services, amend section 38142, 71434, 3608, 3610, 3613, 14, 5803, 582903, and 5836. Changes provisions relating to fees, communicable diseases, rehabilitation beds, and acute care beds. Harmonized provisions, repeals the original section, outright repeals section 71, 5803, 01, 71, 5803, 13, and 71, 58, 2906. Legislative Bill 1216, introduced by Senator Bostar, is a bill for enacting relating to revenue and taxation, amend section 77, 3446, change provisions relating to the base limitation, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1217, introduced by Senator Bostar, is a bill for enacting relating to revenue and taxation, amend section 77, 1333, section 77, 202, 20201, 20203. Provide certain property tax exemptions, change provisions related to exemption application procedures and rent restricted housing projects, provides a valuation project for sales restricted houses, harmonized provisions, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1218, introduced by Senator Bostar, is a bill for an act relating to motor fuels, amend section 6301, 302, 664-105, and 7010-0202, as well as section 66-482, section 7010-0101, defines and redefines terms, changes and provides excise fees as prescribed, eliminates obsolete provisions, provides rights and requirements relating to commercial electric vehicle charging stations, direct current fast charging stations, provides powers for electric suppliers, provides a sales and use tax exemption, harmonized provisions, provides operative dates, repeals the original section, declares an emergency. Legislative Bill 1219, introduced by Senator John Kavanaugh, is bill for an act relating to buildings, amend section 71, 6403, 6406, 72, 804, 805, 806, 81, 1608, 81, 1611, 1614, adopts updates to building and energy codes and repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1220, introduced by Senator Boston's bill for an act relating to property, amend section 302446, 302603, 302637, 3816, 3828, 4002, as well as 432707, section 3024-129, and 303402. Changes requirements relating to bonds for personal representatives and small estate affidavits, change provisions relating to certain payments and transfers to minors, provides a protected person to retain an attorney as prescribed, change the requirement relating to co-trustees, change provisions relating to healthcare powers of attorney, the Uniform Trust Code and the Uniform Code and the Nebraska Uniform Power of Attorney Act, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1221, issued by Senator Days, bill for an act relating to public health and welfare, amend section 71-5-1604, provides requirements to staff training for persons with Alzheimer's disease, dementia, or related disorders as prescribed and repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1222, introduced by Senator Days, bill for an act relating to Nebraska Juvenile Code, amend sections 43-292 and sections 43-28301, 43-29202, change provisions relating to termination of parental rights and parental support, harmonized provisions, repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1223, introduced by Senator Days, bill for an act relating to appropriations, appropriates funds to the Department of Health and Human Services. Legislative Bill 1224, introduced by Senator Days, bill for an act relating to tracking devices, amend sections 86-103, section 28-101, prohibits certain conduct relating to mobile tracking devices, change provisions relating to intercepted communications, defines and redefines terms, and repeals the original section. Legislative Bill 1225, introduced by Senator McKinney, is a bill for enacting any appropriations, appropriates fund of the Nebraska Commission on Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice. Legislative Bill 1226, introduced by Senator Clements, a bill for enacting appropriations, appropriates funds to the Legislative Council and declares an emergency. Legislative Bill 1227, introduced by Senator Ballard, it's a bill for enacting the Professional Employer Organization Registration Act, and then Section 482706, change provision relating to health benefit plans offered by professional employer organizations as prescribed and repeals the original section. LR 279CA, introduced by Senator Holcroft. A constitutional amendment requiring the legislature to enact laws providing for a minimum sentence of 25 years imprisonment for certain assaults on first responders and a minimum sentence of life imprisonment for certain offenses involving murder of a first responder. Additionally, the reference committee will meet in room 2102 upon noon recess. Finally, Mr. President, a priority motion. Senator Bostelman would move to recess the body until 1:30 p.m.
Senators, the question is, shall the legislature adjourn until recess until 1:30 p.m.? Senator Aguilar, do you have a message?
Thank you, Mr. President. The Revisers of Statutes Office had advised my office that a large number of bill requests have not yet been three-parted for introduction prior to tomorrow's bill introduction deadline. Members are advised that if you have a bill drafting request that has not yet been three-parted and you wish to introduce it, you should request a three-part from the bill drafters by 5 p.m. today in order to allow sufficient time for printing of your request. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Aguilar. The question is, shall the legislature recess until 1:30 p.m.? All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, nay. We're in recess until 1:30 p.m.